Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program produced and funded by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Ralph Eisler.
Hello, and I'm Joe Barnhart, and this is a program sponsored by the Rationalists of East Tennessee and rooted in scholarship, we hope, and free of supernatural belief.
Okay, well, this is a call-in show, but we only have one phone line. So if you can't get through, we invite you to tweet your comments to us at FFTVKNOX. While we go over a few announcements, we invite you to start calling in now at the number on the screen. Get a pen and paper, and we'll give you our email address later in the show.
Okay, and the Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meetup at a place to eat and enjoy friendship. Tonight is a meeting at Barley's in the Old City, starting about 5:30 today.
Okay. You look for the silver-jacketed copy of The God Delusion down there at Barley's. And as Mac Dillahunty at the Atheist Experience says, everyone's welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, conversation, but please don't preach, proselytize, or punch. Just have conversation. Now, the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday mornings are usually lectures and lively roundtable discussions. The second Sunday is a book club meeting, and often a reflections group on the fourth Sunday at somebody's home for a potluck lunch and a more intimate type of conversational situation. Okay. Please visit our websites for additional details, including times and locations.
Very good. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed who wrote the very first books in the Bible, the Torah or the Pentateuch. Today, we're going to talk about the book of Revelation and Prophecies and Revelations. It's called the book of Revelation, sometimes called the New Testament Apocalypse. And we're going to discuss that today. But first, do you have any news?
Yeah, one item caught my eye in the news. Mm-hmm. A young lady named Emily Herx first took time off for work in vitro fertilization treatment. Mm-hmm. Her boss offered what sounded like prayers of encouragement. He said, "You are in my prayers." But soon these words took on a more sinister meaning. Mm-hmm. The Indiana grade school where Herx was teaching was Catholic, and after church officials were alerted that Herx was undergoing in vitro fertilization, making her, in the words of one Monsignor, a grave immoral sinner, it took them less than 2 weeks to fire her. Well, Herx filed a discrimination suit in 2012, and in response, St. Vincent de Paul School in Fort Blaine, South Bend Diocese, her former employers, countered with an argument used by a growing number of religious groups to justify firings related to in vitro fertilization treatment or pregnancies outside of marriage. To wit, the diocese said freedom of religion gives them the right to hire or fire whomever they choose. Okay, maybe so, but the diocese took it one step farther. It is arguing, in this instance, that its religious liberty rights protect the school from having to go to court at all. In other words, they're trying to disassociate themselves completely away from American secular law in this society. And I think this is a very scary trend. We've seen what happened in the case of Hobby Lobby.
Yes, it's a very scary trend.
So Brian House, staff attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union, said he can't find any other cases like this before. This group's not directly involved in the lawsuit, but is supporting Herx. And what he implies what the diocese is saying is we can fire anybody, and we have absolute immunity from even going to trial, as long as we think they're violating our religion. And to have civil authorities even to look into what we're doing is a violation. It's astonishing. Can you imagine if some Islamic group made this argument about Sharia law?
Well, that sounds like Sharia law. And one of the problems with this is whenever you have a religion, it breaks into details. If you don't publicize all the details, it leaves it up to the ownership to just determine
Yeah.
when it's religion and when it's not.
Well, anyhow, Herx is framing her suit as being proof of a religious discrimination, or sexual discrimination, rather, and the church wants to take the opposite view, that if they would give her back her job, they'd be violating their religious principles. So this is the headbutting that we're coming to in this society for our laws in America versus the religious laws that these churches want.
I'm a teetotaler. Now, I don't drink at all. Do I have a right, if I have somebody working for me, to fire that person if they at home drink beer? I don't think so.
No. Well, and anyhow, I think there are more problems like this arising. And Trudy Rubin, who writes for the Washington Post, had an interesting column in this Sunday's Knoxville News Sentinel on just this problem of America coming apart at the seams because of, well, political and religious conflicts that are coming about.
That's ridiculous. I mean, that's what some of the founding fathers were pro-religious and pro-freedom. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you've got a religion, pay for it on your own. Don't let other people pay for it, and live your own life, but don't use the government to promote your religion. Otherwise, it's not a religion.
Yes, right.
It's not freedom of conscience anymore.
Right. Okay, well, there are lots of other things we could talk about in the news, but I think maybe we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about Bible prophecy, and or as it says up there,
the book of Revelation.
When prophecy fails.
So what do you think of the book of Revelation?
Well, most of what we were talking about is in this book by Elaine Pagels that is called Revelations, and it doesn't deal so much with the actual stories that are in the book, shall we say, but it deals with what the writer was trying to do, this fellow John of Patmos. And he apparently was a Jew.
Apparently a Jewish Christian.
A Jewish Christian.
Yeah.
But not in the Pauline cast.
It's a good point. In Galatians 1 and 2, you see a severe division between Paul and Peter and James on and James on one side, and Peter and Paul says, "I oppose Peter to his face." I mean, that's pretty severe language.
Yeah,
and because the issues were very severe.
Yeah, a lot of people have the impression that Jesus founded a religion, and he really didn't. But other people, more realistic, say, well, Paul founded Christianity. And perhaps in a sense he did, but what they don't realize is that shortly after Jesus' death, there were a number of competing groups, and these didn't suddenly coalesce into one orthodoxy. It actually took a couple hundred years,
centuries to do that.
To arrive at where the Catholic Church became the Orthodox religion of the Roman Empire, or became what I'll call the main cult of Christianity at the time. So anyhow,
but I've got an interesting thing. This is in Baptist Today. And I thought the guy does an interesting job. He says, have you ever been promised something, but the fulfillment was so long in coming, you despaired of its ever happening?
Yeah.
I think he does a good job on this. And then he says, gives an example of one member of the family says, we're going to have a house someday.
Yeah.
And you wonder if it's ever going to come about.
Yeah.
Then he's referring to a passage in 2 Peter. Now, he's a scholar, so he recognizes 2 Peter wasn't really written by Peter. It was written probably after the first century, at least the second half of the first century. So that's long after the death of Jesus.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a pseudonymous writer. He says that that sort of thing happened in that day. People wrote in other people's
Oh, yeah.
names.
Yeah, sure.
And but anyhow, the second coming hasn't come about. And he points out in his writing here very clearly that these early believers believed that Jesus said this supernatural intervention was going to take place in his generation.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it simply didn't happen. And so they had to renegotiate.
Yes.
And that's, in science, you often try to make predictions off of your research.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reason you keep good records is to see if it actually took place. And if your predictions don't come about, then that means you've got to rework your theory, or your experiment went wrong or something, but you don't use strange language to cover it up. And you don't call it a metaphor either.
Yeah, yeah.
You just say, well, it didn't work.
Right, right.
And the more precise the prediction is, the better the science is. If I say to you something great is going to happen in your living room 2 years from now, I really haven't said very much.
No, and that's one of the things that we find in the biblical literature, that it is very obscure in many cases, very nonspecific. It's like Nostradamus. There are a lot of people who are hung up on his writings, you know, but they're so obscure that you can interpret them almost any way that you want.
That's like a Rorschach test.
Right, and so if you want to believe, if you form your beliefs first and then look at the writings to support them, well, you'll find something in there whereby you can support them.
But Jesus apparently, if you take parts of the New Testament seriously, did believe in a cosmic catastrophic change.
Mm-hmm.
And it was to be soon, and it didn't come about. And Paul apparently expected it to come about, according to this writer, who's a good Baptist scholar, and he believed it was coming soon. And it simply didn't happen. The apostolic ancestors had predicted a quick return of Christ, but none of them saw it, for they were all dead. Nothing had happened.
Yeah.
And so they had to reconfigure. And he has, what he says, it's 2 Peter tries to refigure. And why did this not come about? Well, according to the 2 Peter there, it's because the Lord is preparing to just demolish everything. It takes time to do that. Next thing is that, and here's one of my favorites, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years.
Yes, yes.
Well, that is the biggest loophole as you can find.
Yes.
And you talk about relativism.
Yes, of course, and that's what...
That's not moral relativism.
That's what the biblical fundamentalists always or often use, that you cannot interpret the 6 days of Genesis as 6 literal days.
Yeah, some do and some don't. It's true,
right.
Yeah.
So some do and some don't. And again, it's a case where if you find something in the Bible that supports what you want to believe, then you'll interpret literally. And if it doesn't, then you'll interpret it figuratively. So,
so they came up then, the third view on trying to justify this failure is God is patient, and he's postponing the end because he wants more people to repent. I remember in my youth, when I heard preachers talk this way, it occurred to me, while they're waiting for all these people to repent, more people are being born
who are going to hell.
It's going to be, and it's going to be worse, not better. And apparently the author just didn't think of it when he wrote that.
Yeah.
And then the fourth way of trying to deal with that was simply to say, well, it never was meant to be taken literally, that this is just going to come like a thief in the night, and it's unpredictable. So you've had Christians moving, understandably, in all directions.
Oh, yeah, sure. And I mean, when did the rapture first become an item among Christians? Early part of the 20th century or something?
In the 19th century, it was a very big thing with the Millerites.
Yes, that's right.
I like what this.
But again, you bring up Millerites as an interesting case that. This fellow Miller, he was preaching upstate New York, and he got his flock to go up on this hill one night and wait to be raptured, and it didn't happen. And so they came back down, and he said, oh, he was off by a year, so they went up the night following year, and the same thing happened. You think that they would have given up, but no, they eventually evolved into the Seventh-day Adventists, and it's like the scientific versus religious experience you were talking about, that when the scientist, if the facts, as he tests them, don't match his theory, he discards the theory. And as they say with the creationist, if the facts don't match the theory, he discards the facts. And so...
well, you had, with the Mormons, you had the Latter-day Saints. They're part of that 19th century movement, you know, of thinking, well, these are the last days. And if you stretch the word last out for centuries, I mean, you can always be right, but you haven't really said anything. And I'm old enough to remember the Second World War, all kinds of predictions as to who the Antichrist was.
Oh, yeah, that's sort of a game that gets played all the time, doesn't it?
Everywhere from Mussolini to Adolf Hitler to the Pope.
Yeah, and
FDR was...
keeps coming back to the Pope. Well, I think there's some people who believe Obama's the Antichrist now, too.
You know. They talk that way.
So, and again, that's a figure that arises out of Revelation without...
Paul has it in one of his epistles.
Oh, does he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's... but anyhow, the concept is in Revelation for sure. And, well, what I like about this particular writer, who, after analyzing this, he said, we are called to live rightly where we are. And in other words, he just says, let's just live a good life.
Yeah.
And he kind of puts this aside as saying, you know.
Yeah.
When I was in the seminary...
So wait a minute, let me ask you, who publishes this? Is this, this doesn't sound like Southern Baptist,
This is not Southern Baptist. These are called moderate Baptists.
Yeah, okay.
And they're more scholarly and more willing to learn from others. And,
right.
Oh, yeah. In fact, these and the Southern Baptists are divided among themselves. I remember I wrote a book called The Southern Baptist Holy War on this split.
Okay. So you were going to go on to something else there when I interrupted you?
Well, I wanted to emphasize this book here, When Prophecy Failed, written by a good Old Testament scholar. And he brings in what's called falsification. That's what Karl Popper, in his book Conjectures and Refutations, and in his book Objective Knowledge, emphasizes so crucial to science. If you don't make predictions in your theories and your calculations that are falsifiable, that is, if somebody can't test them specifically, it's not a theory. It's not a good prediction.
Yeah, maybe for our audience out there, we ought to explain that the philosophy of science done by people who are concerned with how science works. How do we know things? The epistemology of science. How do we understand what is really true and not? And scientists, I believe, are generally agreed that science doesn't prove things. The general public misunderstands a lot of this. Science doesn't prove things. What it does is it takes a number of possibilities and it tries to narrow them down until it finds the most probable explanation for a phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so in this sense, you can never say, well, you prove something absolutely, or you know this absolutely. You can know it can be highly probable that it will happen, or if it's repeated, etc. But the one thing you can do is falsify many of those predictions from your theory. So you can do 1,000 experiments, and you don't prove something's absolutely true, but you can do one experiment and prove an idea is wrong.
Yeah, at least some part of it's collapses.
At least some part of it.
Yeah.
And that's the way science progresses.
Yeah. Then you say, well, we've got to refigure and show where we went wrong. And that's called not bearing false witness.
Yes, right.
You can't have science. The word science just means knowledge.
Yeah.
And you can't have the advance of knowledge without knowing when you failed in your predictions.
Right. And science tends to be self-correcting, because if somebody publishes something and people try to repeat it, and they can't repeat it, then the science eventually corrects itself. Or you find an error, perhaps in the first guy's work, you very seldom find outright fraud. Sometimes you do, but usually it's a mistake. In how carefully you've treated the experiment or something of that sort.
Yeah.
So
the reason it's so difficult in fields like psychology and sociology is the units that are studied have so many variables. And Adam doesn't behave according just to having opinions.
no.
Human beings can have opinions and they're suddenly changed.
Yeah.
And so it's much more difficult to study human behavior, it seems to me.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I study atoms all the time. You know, atoms are my friends. And I can tell you they behave very rationally, just as you would expect them to in most cases.
I'm afraid my species doesn't always.
So
now we're talking in the book of Revelation. I'm sympathetic with the writer in many ways. Apparently these people, the time he was writing, somewhere around maybe 96.
Yeah. 96, the common era.
That's the Roman Empire. Apparently it didn't begun to pounce on some of these Christians. And after all, what we call religious liberty wasn't very popular in the Roman Empire. I mean, they had some religious liberty, but you had to really work to get it. And so these guys, apparently this John had been exiled on an island, best we can figure out. And he's angry, understandably. And he conjures up and thinks he's got a vision in which there's going to be divine wrath. Now he gets carried away with his wrath.
Yes.
So, you know, he's really angry. But you can sympathize.
Turns out to be sort of the Stephen King description of his wrath.
It makes Stephen King look kind of mild. But it's rage in many ways. I think this is a book of rage.
Yes.
And I mean, I can understand it. It's a human heart who's really furious that he and his friends have been treated this way, unfairly.
By the Romans.
By the Romans, yes.
And at the same time, he considers himself more or less an Orthodox Jew. Even though he's a Christian, he still wants that Jewish tradition to be passed along to what he thinks Christianity is, which is not what Paul does. Paul goes to the Gentiles, and he tells them they don't have to be circumcised. They can eat meat that was sacrificed to pagan gods, which was a practice usually. Take it to the temple, kill it, and, you know, cook it and all that. And so he is decrying this whole kind of what would be at that time modernistic attitude.
Well, you know, you're right.
Christianity
was the liberal version of Christianity.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the book of Revelation, if I'm understanding you, is more conservative.
Yes.
Saying we are Christians, but we're Jews with our tradition. Now, of course, that's different from Jews. I mean, Jews are very divided today.
Yeah, sure.
But these were what would be called more Orthodox at that time. And now, to be fair to the Jews at that time, they had to fight with the Roman government. They had to make all kinds of deals and even fight just to get some tolerance by the Roman government. So you can see this writer is very eager for the Christians, not of Paul's type, getting in on it, messing up their...
Well, he's, yeah, exactly. And he's fantasizing, you know, what you'd sit down and think you'd like to happen to your worst enemies all the time, and he does it in this sort of colorful language and with all these mythological inventions thrown in, and
that was typical of that. That's kind of apocalyptic literature. You had lots of that after about 586. When the
Babylonian captivity.
Then there developed slowly an apocalyptic literature, because then they realized they'll never seemingly ever be the kingdom they once were under David, and so they envisioned a more supernatural inbreak.
Yeah, and I think this is a time that Yahweh perhaps became really cemented into the Jewish consciousness as the one God.
One God, universal God.
Well, as the personal God of the Israelites.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I think this happened during the Babylonian captivity, because before that, the Jews were polytheistic in many cases.
Well, you know, I think what they started polytheistic. There's no question about that. And then some of the prophets tried to develop monotheism, and others. I mean, there's constant battle.
Yes.
And you see that even when they had monotheism developing, they still had to have a lot of archangels. In other words, God apparently had to delegate.
Yeah, sure.
And you had, in the book of Job, we've talked about the sons of God. And your sons of God in Genesis 6. So you do have many supernatural beings. It's a kind of compromise. On the one hand, it is monotheism, but you got a hierarchy of...
Well, yeah, but it evolves over historical times. For instance, I think we had this discussion with Aaron Darby a couple of weeks ago that this woman, Jezebel, she was a bad person according to the Bible. There wasn't anything so bad about her. She was a Phoenician princess who was married off to Ahab, who was the son of Omri, who was a general who became king of Israel at one time. And this was common. You marry off your daughters to form political relationships. And we know that happened in Europe all the time, you know. Sure. And but she brought her god, Baal, along, and the Jewish priests didn't like it. It was the priests who, as you say, who wanted their own god there, and they didn't like that. And so this evolves all down through the centuries. And
you even have a dialect, Baal, and you got El.
Yeah,
Elohim. I mean, you got vowel problems here.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, in ancient Hebrew, you didn't even have vowels. So,
right. In the writing,
pronunciations themselves are the big.
Yeah.
So you had the Canaanite gods.
Right.
And it was emerging.
Yeah. So, Sam, do we have promotion? Okay. So we're going to take a little break here, and we'll be back with you in a few minutes.
If you live in or around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org. If you live in or around the Knoxville area.
All right, well, we're back here with you, and we're on Freethought Forum and discussing when prophecy fails.
Yeah.
Remember, this is a call-in show, and we would really like to have some of you call in and give us some of your thoughts or perhaps ask questions.
Talk with us. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be on this particular subject necessarily. We have wisdom for everything.
A little thin coat of it. Isn't it?
Thin coat of it, a veneer.
Well, out of this prophecy developed particularly in the 19th century, you had what's called the post-millennial view.
Uh-huh.
And the post means after the millennium. And that was more of a day of optimism as before the First World War. And they developed the theory, some of the Christians, that now that the Civil War is over, gradually the kingdom of God then will come in, sending missionaries out and more preaching and getting rid of slavery. You can see they can get more optimistic now.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God is coming. And then after this period of getting better and better, then the millennium sets in. And of a 1,000-year reign.
Right.
And then, of course, then eternity sets in.
Right, right.
And then when, especially the Second World War came into play, it developed what's called the premillennial view. And that's the view things are not getting better and better, they're getting worse and worse. And so the millennium is going to come later, because in the premillennial view, especially what's called the pre-trib, pre-tribulation, premillennial view, the second coming will come like a thief in the night, and the saints will be taken up in the air. This is from the Apostle Paul.
Yes.
In just a split second, and then for a period of 7 or 3.5 to 7 years, depends on which version you read on that, you have the Great Tribulation, in which the Satan and his group take over because all the saints are now in heaven, and the world is getting bad. And so that period of Great Tribulation goes, and then after that, Christ comes and has the 1,000-year reign. He comes back to earth.
Correct.
So first of all, though, you have before this happened, the great vacuum cleaner in the sky.
Oh, yes, the rapture.
All the believers, the rapture.
Yes,
taken up.
yes. And, of course, this all gets made up as one goes along through the centuries, you know. It's not that it's suddenly revealed. It's working and reworking these ideas.
Well, when I was 14, you'll enjoy this, my Uncle John and Aunt Ada, very good relatives, dear to me, but they gave me a Bible, and it was a Schofield Reference Bible, and it's very dispensational. It had all this broken down in great detail. I thought.
Yes.
We've got a caller, so let's see what we have. Go ahead, caller. Let's hear it. Please.
Caller, can you give us a name or a nickname?
Yeah, caller is fine.
Okay, caller.
Yeah, I was wanting to call up. Your show started off really interesting when you were talking about the sectarian people there snubbing their nose at the law of the land like we don't even... I mean, as a matter of fact, I think you should do a show on that later. As I understand it, there's a lot of churches, maybe the Baptist church, I believe maybe one of them, that have their own courts where they try their own cases, even if it is a criminal activity. they do not feel obligated to report it to any civil authorities.
I never heard of that.
I
but
think you've got it in the South. The Baptists are going to be a dumping ground. And I don't think that's fair to all Baptists at all. So back off on that.
Well, let me say Christian then, because you do realize that there are courts within religious organizations.
Yes, but I thought they were mostly concerned with heresies, for example. You know.
No, some of them are child abuse and things like that.
Oh.
So, that might make for an interesting show, but since you're talking about prophecy, I was wanting to go through, ask you your opinion on this. Bringing this prophecy out of the dry situation of the Old Testament and all of that, but down to our everyday life. Wouldn't it be prophecy if Pat Robertson comes on TV and in the last 5 minutes of his show, where I think he has God on retainer, because God always shows up in the last 5 minutes of the show, where he says, John is being cured of his baldness right now. Now, would you consider that to be prophecy? Especially if you consider that John may not be watching the show because it's videotaped right now. It's actually broadcast 24 hours a day around the world, so John may see it 6 hours later. So that's actually prophecy. Would you agree?
Well, we had in seminary, when I was going to seminary, we had a word that's called pro-prophet.
Pro-prophet, yeah.
P-R-O-F-I-T.
Maybe prophecy.
It makes good entertainment.
I wouldn't. Yes or no on that?
Well, my opinion would be no.
It's not prophecy?
I would not call it prophecy.
Well, it's not to be taken all that seriously. It has.
Well, it's as far as being taken seriously in our everyday lives. Here you have a multimillionaire who is influencing people to vote Republican, so I'm taking it seriously.
Okay.
Well, I'm taking that seriously. I'm not. But we're just talking about definitions, words.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well, if it's, I was thinking it would be prophecy because he's saying God is going to do something, and prophecy usually is I'm telling you that God is doing something or going to do something.
Okay, well, I think you would agree. The meaning of a word is the way people use it, and some people do use the word the way you're talking. It's
okay.
Other people use the word prophets, like the prophets, and they're not so much predictions at all. They're prophets who are calling for justice and concern for the poor.
But
that's a new ball.
In our lives, is not prophecy predicting the future that God is going to do something? I mean, that's the way I use it.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you say that he's going to grow hair on a bald head, okay, maybe I have a little bit of an aspect that it has to be something more grandiose.
Yeah, that's,
for instance,
that's small time prophecy.
Well, that does. I mean,
so,
if bald John grows hair, God, that's a miracle.
Well,
praise the Lord.
But let's put it this way. If Pat Robertson said the world was going to end on January 15th, 2015, I would call that prophecy. Okay? Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses used to make predictions like that. And they made so many predictions that never came true that they quit making the predictions.
Yeah. Now, if somebody could make predictions to cure baldness.
Well, no prediction that God is going to cure John's baldness. I would think that's prophecy. Obviously, y'all don't. So I can't go on to my next step.
Well, let's go ahead and accept. Let's go ahead and accept that as prophecy.
Yeah, you may have a good point anyhow. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, anyway, if someone makes this prophecy in God's name and it does not occur, as I understand the use of God's name in vain, it means either worthless or it does not come to pass. In other words, you've said God is going to do something and he didn't. You've used God's name in vain. Is that correct?
I think you're on the target on something. I think that passage probably was to prevent people from using the word God in such a trivial manner to get their own way. And I think you're getting on something very important, and I think this is a good example.
Okay, so if you've used God's name in vain, what is the sin that's associated with that?
Well, it is a sin of its own.
Oh, it's not blasphemy?
Well, I started to say it's pretty close to blasphemy, yeah.
Okay, so we can now conclude that Pat Robertson is a blasphemer that's on TV every day, 5 days a week. Now, why isn't Obama doing something about this?
What's Obama doing?
Well, I think Darrell Issa should hold a hearing on it and get to the root of it.
Okay. Well, I don't want to take up any more time. I would like to get into Peter Popaw's miracle spring water, but there's probably some other people that'd like to call, so let me get off here. And thank you very much for your help with these. I was wondering if I was on the right track.
Okay. Well, as we know, there's a history of people who've, from fortune tellers to all kinds of people who tried to do this sort of thing. Even people who make trivial marriage proposals and make big promises.
Oh, yeah.
And turn out to be they can't deliver.
Yeah, well, we have maybe what I'll call prophecy after the fact a lot of times, that if somebody flies an airplane into a building, okay, that was God's punishing us for the sins of America, okay?
Yeah. That's Jerry Falwell.
Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, and why didn't they tell us before? I mean, that would have been a helpful prophecy to tell us that these guys were thinking about that.
Oh, that would have been helping somebody else rather than themselves. Oh,
yes, that would have been. Well, in any case, so we have all these Bible prophecies, and particularly in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, they try to tie their message very much to the Old Testament prophecies. People.
Yes, yes. In fact, that's a real good point. Is there you have the Hebrew Bible, and so you take passages, particularly from Isaiah 40. Isaiah 53, and in my opinion, convince yourself that these guys were actually talking centuries ahead of time.
Yes.
Like, behold, the Hebrew translation is a young woman shall conceive.
Right.
Now, Alma, I think, is the Hebrew word.
Yes, right.
And not virgin, just young woman, and you would assume there would be virgins, but that's not the point. And then the writers in say in Matthew is making this a prediction of a virgin birth. Now, I think it's fair to say when you do history, don't read anachronisms. In other words, don't read your day into their day.
Right.
You try to say, what did they mean, not what I would like them to mean.
Yes, absolutely.
But I'm afraid that much of the New Testament is reading into the Old Testament.
Yeah.
No.
I agree with you.
Now, I think you could say this, that it is fair to say, well, here's something, say, in the Old Testament, and we've got the same principle, we'd like to apply it. But that's different from saying this is exactly what the author was saying, predicting our day. I think that's dishonest.
Yes, of course, but this is one way to try to justify very strange beliefs.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And so if you have somebody centuries before predicting a virgin is going to give birth, then boy, you tie that into your Savior, right? But as you say, the original words were young woman, apparently.
Yes.
And it may have been translated to Parthenos in Greek or something of the sort, which meant virgin.
And virgin, yeah.
And so,
well,
of course...
I think what happened there is by the time you get to the New Testament time, you've got the influence of the Greek religions and
Oh, yeah.
and the gods coming down and producing kids with females, and you have this spiritualized, but nevertheless you have this kind of a combination of the Greek and the Hebrew put together in the New Testament.
Yeah, that's
birth
because we all have these translations, right, of the Gospels in Greek.
Yeah, and even in the Greek, you know, by the time you get to Matthew, Matthew probably has had Paul's influence.
Yeah.
There, and so you're trying to have this God coming into being, and yet, like some of the Greek gods, they were humanized, and yet, some of these Greek gods walk on earth, and people don't recognize them.
Oh yes, yes,
You
yeah.
have that passage in Luke 22, I believe. I have to look it up again, in which, on the road to Emmaus, these two disciples are talking with Jesus. They don't even know who he is, but they supposedly have been disciples, just seen him a few days earlier, presumably. Don't recognize the voice or his face.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like borrowing from the Greeks and putting into.
That's a good point too. Yeah, I like that. And of course, Paul's message was to the Gentiles, so he was associating with the Greeks and the non-Jews, the Greeks and the Romans, people like that, and they were the ones that he was pulling into Christianity. And so it's inconceivable they were going to leave everything behind from their old religion.
Exactly.
So, yes, I can believe that all right.
To rework it, and that's why it's called the New Testament.
Right.
And then, in many ways, all cultures do this. I mean, I sometimes read the Bible, and I say, well, I don't think they're... If you look at the word God sometimes in the Hebrew Bible and translate the community, it makes more sense. The community has mercy, community has law, the community demands, has grace.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get in the position to say that's what the author was saying, so I think that would be dishonest.
Yes. Okay.
I'm trying to make sense of what he was trying to do, even though I wouldn't say he would agree with the way I put it.
Right. Well, there's certainly a lot of Bible prophecies that one could point out that never came true, although the real fundamentalists would say, well, they all did, but they have to go through a lot of contortions to justify those statements a lot. And I was just thinking about Matthew and Luke, as I say, trying to rely on these old prophecies to legitimize what their views were of Jesus. And the one that always strikes me is the fact that I think in some obscure prophet, maybe Micah, the Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. And they have two completely different ways of getting him born in Bethlehem.
Oh yeah, you got to have a whole census taking.
Yeah, that was it. That was in Luke, that they lived in Nazareth and they had to pick up and move to Bethlehem to go through this, which is preposterous. And then, of course, Matthew has them living in Bethlehem, and then Herod is going to kill all the newborns, and so they move to Egypt. They're totally different stories, completely in opposition.
Some of it sound like the Old Testament, where he had a lot of the Jewish children killed by Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a repetition of
exactly.
the story. In fact, you find a lot of this in the New Testament. It's about in music. It's called a motif,
or a round, maybe. No, motif. Motif is better. Yeah. I like the ring cycle, so I'm used to a lot of motifs coming through.
Well, you got to. I'm sympathetic with the. See, this is an age before science.
Oh, sure.
And even what we call law courts, where you have, more precision on how to guide the jury system. That was still in the developing process. We're still developing it. But the word bearing false witness against your neighbor, that comes apparently out of a legal setting.
Yeah.
You see, don't bear false witness against.
Well, it might have even come out of Hammurabi's code. I don't know.
Yeah, well, even then would have been a legal system. You see, in other words.
Yeah, that was very much a legal system.
What it amounts to is, we've had this on the program before, that these so-called 10 Commandments, most of them came if then. If you want to have a peaceful, stable, happy society, you have to develop certain rules and regulations against stealing and killing
Oh, sure.
and adultery and envy. If you don't control envy, you're going to create a lot of hostility in the community.
Well, yeah, but you know, thou shalt not covet. Well, we have a whole economic system built on coveting. I mean,
Coveting.
I know it's not quite what it meant
It's
in the
another.
Bible.
It means you want to tear something down so you can take somebody over.
Yeah.
Of course, if you have that in economics, it's evil.
I was going to say, look at some of these corporate raiders that we have around now.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
So, anyhow, yes, I agree with you that you have to have laws for a stable society, and the commandments: don't steal, don't lie, don't kill. These are common to any society.
Any society that's going to work at all. Yeah.
Right. They didn't come from God. They came. I mean, even most atheistic societies like communist Russia had the same laws.
Even dogs have to have some rules about not killing, otherwise you're not going to survive as a pack.
Yes.
On their own, they can't kill each other off, and they can't steal each other's food beyond a certain point. Otherwise, they're going to be stealing rather than cooperating to take prey.
Yeah, that's quite true. So you have all these rules, but you have some that seem to be particularly useless, like not eating shellfish, say.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see, and trying to trace some of these rules back to see if they had some practical input.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't
some
either.
think pork,
Yeah, people always say that, well, they didn't eat pork because pork was unclean. Perhaps that's the way the animals were kept at that time or something or not. I can go along with that and see that. In fact, even in this country, up until people were really taught properly, you could get trichinosis from eating pork if you didn't cook it well. And things like that. But I look at a lot of those. Do we have caller?
Yeah, we've got a good caller.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead for our speaker. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, the guy with the Schofield Bible.
Okay, go ahead.
It says at the bottom of the screen, when prophecy fails, there's no prophecy that has ever failed that's in the Bible.
Okay.
Well,
I give you, for an example, Isaiah 7:14. Behold, I give you a sign. A virgin shall conceive and bear a child. Thou shalt call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted, God with us. And that was fulfilled when Jesus Christ was born.
Jesus was
700 years later.
Jesus was not called Emmanuel. That wasn't his name. His name was Jesus.
He was called Emmanuel, the everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
No, he was not called Emmanuel. He's called Jesus.
Joshua. Yeah.
Well, you
Yeshua.
limit the names of what you know what God is called. God is called by 100 different names.
I'm sorry, but you're not being coherent here.
Okay,
His name
Jehovah?
wasn't Emmanuel.
Who's Jehovah? Who's Elohim?
Actually, Jehovah is not a name. It's a combination of a Yahweh and Adonai.
You're missing the subject. When prophecy fails, there's not a prophecy that has ever failed that's in the Bible.
Okay,
I can.
Tell me one.
I can.
Okay, here's one. You won't agree with me, but this is my view and not yours. I think Jesus really expected a supernatural inbreak in his time.
So what?
Now, the audience will understand what I'm talking about. Just let me give you this. The supernatural cataclysmic event, he expected it.
Yeah.
Okay.
He planned for it before he created the world.
Are you asking for my view or an opportunity for you to preach?
No, it's an opportunity to tell you the truth.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jesus didn't create
Okay,
the world.
If you want to have my opinion, I'll give
It
it.
seems that I'm more educated in this area than you, don't you think?
Okay, did you want my opinion or not?
No, I want you to say.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
All right.
I'll give you my opinion, but I'm not paying for another man to preach on my time. The prophecy that failed, and now this is my interpretation, and our audience, what we're saying to our audience is let our audience think about these things and they make up their own minds.
Yeah, sure.
You know, that's all we're interested in. But I think Jesus really expected a great cataclysmic descent of the kingdom of God on earth in his time. And I think he taught this. And my opinion, and the opinion of some biblical scholars, is when he was on the cross, when he cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He wasn't just quoting a passage from the Bible, just for the heck of it. I think he really felt that it had failed. And I don't think that a writer just invented that. I think, I mean, he wouldn't have any great motive for inventing that. I think this is probably a real happening, and he felt that what he expected just didn't come about.
Yeah, those are the opening words of the 22nd Psalm.
Yes.
That Matthew put into his mouth, and maybe they were
I think they
actually there.
I mean, there were all kinds of psalms he could have quoted.
Yes.
But I think this is a representation of what happened. And Paul, in his preaching, say in Thessalonians, there is expecting the end to come about. And it simply didn't come,
and hasn't yet.
And there is what's called, see, we mentioned the premillennialists.
Yeah.
And the caller is a premillennialist, I can tell. And then we mentioned the postmillennialists. And then there's the amillennialists. And there are those who say the amillennial is just a figure of speech, a metaphor. And it's simply saying that the kingdom of God is already in our hearts.
Oh, yes.
And it's not a cataclysmic intervention into history.
Yeah, I had recently started reading Bart Ehrman's newest book called How Jesus Became God.
It's a very good book.
And I haven't finished it yet. I'm almost through. But he goes through a number of discussions about different ways that people could become gods in the ancient world.
Oh,
yeah. And so I'm just sort of getting to the part where he's dealing with what he thinks Jesus' mindset was and what his position would be, and how he identified himself with this so-called Son of Man, which is a rather shadowy figure in the Gospels.
Yeah, that's well, that's a figure that already had developed before Paul.
Yes.
Some of the, I don't know whether it's Ethiopic Enoch. I'd have to look it up again. But
yeah.
But anyhow, also it's in Philippians 2, where he says, this is Paul talking, he humbled himself and became human. And Bart Ehrman thinks that Jesus is more like a divine angel, almost, not a second person of the Trinity.
Yeah, right. Well, we're going to have to wrap up here. We only have about a minute to go. So get out your pen and paper. And this has been Freethought Forum, program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee.
And send in feedback, if you would. Leave voicemail at 865-272-9060, or email us. And you can see that on the screen sometimes. I don't remember our email.
No, it's okay.
And freethoughtforum@yahoo.com. That's what it is, yeah. Freethoughtforum@yahoo.com.
Right. And the Rationalists of East Tennessee, we usually have book club on Tuesdays, but we won't have one, sorry, not Tuesdays, but on the second Sunday, we won't have one in December. I'm sorry. So